Chapter 1. The voice in the wind sea crashed relentlessly against the rocks below, a constant chorus of foam and fury, perched upon the cliffs of St. Emile. A forgotten lighthouse stood like a sentinel of an era long gone its once polished brass fixtures, now dulled by salt and neglect, its great lens clouded by dust, its silence profound. But that silence had recently been broken. A series of frantic letters unsigned, typewritten, trembling with desperation, had reached Mademoiselle Amélie Varnet, the wealthy heiress of the Varnet shipping fortune. The final note arrived just 2 days prior. It read, "There are voices in the lighthouse. They are not mine. If I disappear, tell Hercule Poirot." That was all. No address. No name, no explanation, yet it was enough to bring Hercule Poirot, the most famous detective in Europe, from his elegant apartment in London to this remote stretch of the Breton coast, where the Atlantic gnawed hungrily at the stone and secrets festered. In the salt air, he arrived at dusk, accompanied by the sea breeze and an expression of polite distaste. Poirot disembarked from the train in a grey three-piece suit far too formal for the coastal weather, a silk handkerchief tucked neatly in his breast pocket, and his moustaches gleaming like a pair of commas ready to punctuate his disdain. Do, he murmured to himself, stepping onto the platform at Saint-Émile-sur-Mer, to be summoned by an unsigned letter. Without explanation, this is not the way one invites Hercule Poirot. No. Waiting for him was Mademoiselle Varnet herself. She was in her early 30s, tall and striking, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that hinted at sleepless nights. Her gloved hands clutched the last letter. "You came," she said, her voice brittle with relief. "I wasn't sure you would." Poirot tilted his head. "Mademoiselle, you mention in your telegram that someone is speaking from an abandoned lighthouse, that you fear this may lead to a death. You must understand such oddities. They are my raison d'être." They drove in a quiet motor car through windswept coastal roads. The lighthouse rose into view like a skeletal monument. The locals called it La Tour des Silences, the Tower of Silences. It had been decommissioned for over a decade after a tragic incident involving a young keeper who'd vanished during a stormy night. His body was never found. Since then, no one had lived there, and only the most reckless children dared venture near. "There have been disturbances," Amélie said as they neared. Voices heard from inside, lights seen through the windows, even though there is no electricity. A villager claims to have seen someone standing in the lantern room just last week. And the voice, Poirot asked. She hesitated. "It's a woman's voice, calling out a name, Marceau, over and over. At night, always when the wind is high." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "Marceau, that is a name." "Yes, the name of my father's old business partner. They quarreled bitterly 15 years ago. Marceau disappeared. Some say he fled with embezzled funds. Others," she glanced at the lighthouse, "others say he never left the coast." Poirot said nothing, but his fingers adjusted his cuffs. The sea always reminded him of endings. They parked a short distance from the lighthouse. Even from outside, one could feel it, the wrongness. The locked gate had been forced open, the stone path overgrown. The front door, a heavy iron slab, stood ajar. Poirot stopped at the threshold, placing one patent leather shoe just inside. "No police have investigated." Amélie shook her head. "I tried. They said it was superstition, that I was being melodramatic." Poirot said quietly. "The melodrama. It is often where the truth hides." They stepped inside. The interior was shrouded in moss, decay, and the lingering chill of something unwelcoming. Dust coated the wooden floors, but Poirot noticed at once footprints. Recent. He followed them up the spiral staircase. The only sound the tap-tap of his shoes on rusted iron. Emily stayed below. Too frightened to follow. On the second level what had once been the keeper's quarters, Poirot found an overturned chair, a broken wine glass, and something far more curious, a small gramophone, old and cracked, beside it a phonograph record. And labelled, Poirot examined it, his fingertips never touching the grooves. Interesting. He whispered, who plays records in an abandoned tower? He turned toward a writing desk and found something else, a half-written letter in a man's hand. I cannot live with what I saw. She is still here, watching, speaking. If this reaches anyone, remember Marceau was innocent. Poirot's brows arched. He stared out through the small round window into the blue-black ocean below. A voice cried out, faint, distant, Marceau. Poirot turned slowly. But he was alone. Or so it appeared. His eyes narrowed, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. The little grey cells had begun to stir. Chapter 2. The footprints in the dust. The wind howled against the lighthouse walls, making them groan with the weight of age and memory. Hercule Poirot stood motionless in the abandoned keeper's quarters, the faded letter still in his hand. The scrawled message was incomplete. Abrupt. Almost panicked, he read it again, silently. I cannot live with what I saw. She is still here, watching, speaking. If this reaches anyone, remember Marceau was innocent. The handwriting trembled on the page, not from age or wear, but from fear. Poirot carefully folded the note and slid it into his breast pocket. He moved back to the gramophone. It was crude and outdated, likely from the early 1910s, but the needle was clean, and the turntable had been oiled recently. Someone had been using it. He lifted the record gently. It bore no label, no title, just faint scratches from repeated plays. Odd, he thought, for such care to be taken with so fragile a thing. He turned to the door, but paused. Something else just beneath the broken wine glass on the floor caught his attention. Poirot crouched delicately and retrieved a small brass button, tarnished but intact. It had no markings, but the stitching remnants on the back suggested it had once belonged to a tailored uniform or expensive coat. He examined the footprints next. They led down the stairs, overlapping his own. But, curiously, some tracks led further up toward the lantern room at the top of the tower. Always upward, Poirot murmured, adjusting his tie. It is where the light once lived, eh? With deliberate care, he ascended. The staircase narrowed as it rose, the sea wind squeezing through the cracks in the structure, giving each step a mournful whistle. At the top, the lantern room stood, empty. The great light mechanism was inert, its mirrors and gears rusting into stillness. But the air carried something else, an unmistakable scent of recently extinguished candle wax. Poirot bent down beside the main window and touched a streak on the glass. A fingerprint, faint but clear in the residue. Someone had pressed their face here recently. Watching something, perhaps the sea, perhaps something else entirely. And then came a sound. A soft click from below. Poirot stiffened. He descended the steps silently and listened. Footsteps, light, deliberate. A figure emerged into the quarters. He was tall, sharp-faced, with a black raincoat and a photographer's satchel slung across his shoulder. He paused at the writing desk, startled to see the record missing. Then he looked up and saw Poirot descending. They froze, facing each other in the dusky corridor of the winding stairs. Poirot said smoothly, "We are not alone, it seems." The man's hand dropped instinctively to his side, as though reaching for something, perhaps a weapon, perhaps courage. "I didn't break anything," he said quickly. "I'm just here for the story." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And which story is that, monsieur?" The man straightened. "René Lecourt. I'm a freelance journalist. Paranormal features. Mostly. You've probably never read my work. Indeed, I have not. Porritt descended further and stopped at the base of the stairs. But allow me to correct your assumption. You did break something. Rene blinked. What? Porritt gestured behind him. The door, the lock was splintered, and the gate below, forced open. But come, let us not quarrel. Instead, you will explain to me what interest a journalist such as yourself has in a forgotten lighthouse with no official record of hunting or death. Rene hesitated. There's a local legend about a woman who fell or was pushed from the top of this very tower. They say she cries out in the wind. I heard of it from a fisherman. Thought it would make a good feature. I came back last week and saw light through the upper window. Did you enter then? No. I was spooked. Porritt tilted his head, and tonight I couldn't resist. Rene admitted. But I didn't expect anyone else here. Least of all you. Porritt stepped closer. Tell me, Monsieur Lecourt, do you know the name Marceau? A pause, then a slight tightening of the journalist's jaw. No. Should I? Perhaps, perhaps not. We shall see. Porritt produced the brass button, and this, does it seem familiar? Rene peered at it. No markings. Could be from anything. A military coat. Maybe a sailor's jacket. Porritt did not respond. He merely pocketed the button and made a mental note. The journalist was lying subtly, expertly, but lying all the same. His breathing had hitched just slightly at the name Marceau, and his eyes lingered on the record a heartbeat too long. A gust of wind slammed the door below. The two men turned. You are not the only intruder here tonight, Porritt said softly. They made their way down to find Amélie in the vestibule, her face pale. She pointed to the door. Someone else was here, she whispered. I heard her voice. Not outside, the voice was inside. It said my name. Porritt turned to Rene. Then, Monsieur, it seems your story may be much closer to the truth than you imagined. The sea raged beyond the door, but inside, Porritt's mind was sharpening. There were voices, yes, but not spirits. Someone was trying to frighten, to conceal, to manipulate. He would find out who. Chapter 3. The Gathering at La Maison Vanaf. Following morning brought with it no peace. The sun glared over the churning sea, but its warmth did not penetrate the chill that had settled in Porritt's bones. The events of the previous night had left him in deep contemplation. He had returned to his temporary lodgings in the village, an inn far too modest for his tastes, and had slept little. At 10:30, a black motor car arrived to take him to the Varnet estate. Amélie had insisted that Porritt see the house, meet the people connected to her family, and form his own impression of those still orbiting the memory of Marceau Lefebvre. Though she said little of it, Porritt had already guessed she believed the mysterious voice and the letter were part of something rooted not in the supernatural, but in her family's past. La Maison Varnet was an elegant mansion of Belle Epoque design, with towering glass windows, ivy-covered balconies, and the faint scent of damp roses that clung to the garden like an unspoken sorrow. A butler greeted Porritt at the door, stiff and precise. Monsieur Porritt, you are expected in the solarium. Merci, Porritt replied, adjusting his cuffs. And may I ask, who else is expected? The butler hesitated. Mademoiselle Amélie, of course, and Madame Sorel Varnet. Also present are Monsieur Victor de Vigny and the young painter, Miss Violet de Charme. Porritt's brow lifted slightly. A painter, you say? How intriguing. He entered the solarium, a bright room made almost entirely of glass, where morning light danced across marble floors and green vines crept along the corners. Amélie stood near a table of steaming tea and toast. Looking paler than she had the day before, Poirot bowed slightly. "Mademoiselle and your guests," Amélie gestured round the room. "You'll want to meet them for yourself. I think on the chaise lounge reclined Madame Sorel Varnet, Amélie's stepmother. She was in her late 50s, regal in posture, with pale blonde hair immaculately pinned, and a thin, emotionless mouth that seemed made for disapproval. So, she said, her voice dry as parchment, "You're the detective. We are honored to have such a curious guest, though I must confess, I do not believe in ghosts, nor in conspiracies. Madam," Poirot said with a warm smile, "then we are kindred spirits. Neither do I. Only in murder do I believe with proof, natural element." This earned a small frown from Madame Varnet, who returned her gaze to her untouched tea. Seated beside her was Victor de Vigny, a man in his 40s with an intense face and a furrowed brow. He wore a conservative suit, but his fingers thick and ink-stained betrayed his work as the late Etienne Varnet's lawyer and estate manager. "We've had our share of drama in this house," he said as Poirot approached. "But this lighthouse business, it's a distraction. The police aren't interested. And neither am I. That is unfortunate," Poirot murmured, "because I am very interested." "And why is that?" De Vigny asked. "Because a man is dead. Or perhaps two, and someone is trying very hard to ensure that remains forgotten." That silenced de Vigny. Across the room, in a sunlit corner, sat a young woman with a sketchpad balanced on her knees. Her hair was copper-red and wild, her dress far more bohemian than suitable for such a formal household. She didn't look up as Poirot approached. "You are Mademoiselle de Charme?" he asked. She nodded, her charcoal pencil flicking across the page. "Violet. I was commissioned to paint the lighthouse ruins for the estate's archives." Amélie thought it might help reclaim the family's image, make the place less frightening. Ironically, Poirot glanced at the sketch. It was precise, yet evocative. She'd captured the cracked stone, the leaning iron rail, and even the tilt of the sea wind. But there was something else. In one of the windows, tiny, in the shadows, was the hint of a figure. Poirot pointed. "This shadow here. You included it deliberately." She didn't look up. "I saw someone 2 weeks ago, round midnight, standing at the very top. I thought it was a trick of the light. But when I sketched it in, it felt right. You told no one." "I did. De Vigny told me to stop being dramatic. Madame Varnet said it was probably a child playing a prank." She finally met his gaze, but it didn't feel like a prank. Poirot straightened and looked back toward the tea table. "So, we have voices, a figure, and now a second witness, and yet all is treated as nonsense." Amélie, who had been listening silently, spoke at last. "I believe it's connected to what happened to Marceau. My father never spoke of it again after their argument. Marceau vanished. But the whispers didn't." Poirot turned to Madame Varnet. "What do you remember of Monsieur Marceau Lefebvre?" Madame Sorel Varnet's expression remained unreadable. "A difficult man, erratic, too clever for his own good. He and my husband had a falling out. I never inquired about the nature of it, and after his disappearance." She sipped her tea. "Etienne claimed he fled, that he'd embezzled company funds and run to South America. That was the official story. But there were always whispers." Poirot nodded slowly. "And were you aware that someone, perhaps Monsieur Lefebvre himself, had begun to write desperate letters, ending with a plea to inform me?" De Vigny scoffed. "More theatrics?" "None, Monsieur," Poirot said softly. "Desperation. The last letter was unsigned." "Yes, but he knew I would come, that I would not be fooled." There was a silence in the room. Even the sea outside seemed to still. Poirot turned to Amélie. "I must see the family records. Business documents. Letters between your father and Lefebvre, anything. That survived the years. Amelie nodded. They're in the study. I'll have them brought. Poirot offered a slight bow. Then, Samus, the game begins. He walked slowly to the tall windows, gazing out at the distant silhouette of the lighthouse. The truth had begun to stir, and the past was not done speaking. Chapter 4. Poirot makes his entrenched study at La Maison Varnet was precisely what Poirot expected, large, solemn, and meticulously preserved, like a museum of Etty in Varnet's mind. Bookshelves lined the oak-panelled walls, filled with maritime ledgers, dusty law books, and faded volumes on navigation and trade. A faded portrait of Varnet himself hung above the fireplace, an austere man with silver hair, a stubborn jaw, and calculating eyes. The butler led Poirot inside and departed in silence, leaving the detective alone with the late tycoon's memory and a tall leather box resting on the desk. It had been brought down from the attic moments earlier, per Millet's instructions. Inside, Poirot found the surviving correspondence between Varnet and Marceau Lefebvre, dozens of letters tied neatly in faded twine, the earliest dated 1914, the final one from 1920. The year Marceau had vanished, Poirot sat, gloves off, hands clean. He began to read. The early letters were cordial, even affectionate. The two men had started the Varnet Lefebvre Maritime Company together, and their tone reflected partnership, respect, and mutual ambition. We will carve our name into the Atlantic, mon ami. Marceau wrote him one, not through brute force, but by outmaneuvering the larger companies. Precision, integrity, and vision. Poirot raised an eyebrow. He recognized in Marceau's prose the kind of mind that valued clarity, not chaos, a man unlikely to vanish into scandal without reason. But the tone shifted over time. By 1919, their letters turned formal, stiff. Your decision to divert funds from the Serafini route was hasty and potentially ruinous. I will not be silenced, Etienne. There are things in the books I cannot ignore. Poirot paused at that line. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. In the last letter, Marceau wrote simply, I must see you in person, tonight, at the lighthouse. This ends here, Etienne. It was unsigned. No reply was found among the documents. No further letters, just silence. Poirot closed the lid of the box and folded his hands. He whispered to the empty room, the lighthouse, again. A symbolic place, then, and practical, remote, intimidating, chosen not by chance. The door creaked open. Amelie entered quietly, her face pale from reading on her own in the next room. I never knew their quarrel went so deep, she murmured. My father never mentioned any of this. He always said Marceau was a coward, that he betrayed him. Poirot nodded. Madam, tell me what happened after Marceau disappeared. There was a brief investigation, she said, but no one found anything. No body, no trace, and the company issued a statement saying Marceau had absconded with funds and fled the country. The books were adjusted. Everything continued as normal. Poirot raised his eyebrows, adjusted. Mademoiselle, that's the word de Vigny used, adjusted for continuity. I didn't understand it then. I was only 15. Did your father grow wealthier afterward? Yes, she said slowly, enormously, almost overnight. I remember parties. A new yacht, an expansion of the docks in Nantes. Poirot's eyes glinted. Fascinating. De Vigny remained your father's lawyer until the end. She hesitated. Yes, he's been with the family ever since. Even after my father died 2 years ago. Poirot stood and paced slowly to the window, gazing out once more at the sea. The lighthouse was just visible, like a finger pointing skyward, silent, accusatory. Someone, he said, is stirring ghosts, not for mischief, but for warning, the voice in the wind. The figure in the glass, these are not tricks of the mind. Mademoiselle Vonnet, they are traps, meant not for the innocent, but for those who have built their lives on silence. Amélie folded her arms. But who, and why now? Why after so long? Poirot turned. That is what we must determine. Let us review what we know. Monsieur Marceau Lefebvre was a man of reason, not hysteria. He was gravely troubled by irregularities in the company's books. He summoned your father too. The lighthouse. Then, nothing. No body. No scandal. Only an accusation against him and a sudden rise in your father's fortune. He paced slowly. Someone now wants the truth to surface, either because the past has become too heavy to bear, or because something in the present threatens to repeat it. A knock came at the door. It was René Lecourt, the journalist. "I thought you might want to see this," he said, handing Poirot a ruled newspaper. "Found it in the village archive this morning, dated 1920. Poirot unrolled it carefully. The front page bore a headline: "Shipping magnate expands Tiberian trade route, former partner still missing." Below it, a photo of Etienne Varnet, raising a glass, and next to him, unexpectedly, a young Sorel Varnet. Poirot's brow furrowed. Curious, she claimed no involvement with the business. René pointed at a small paragraph in the article. MME, Sorel Varnet, recently wed to the magnate, is said to have inherited shares in the Lefebvre estate after her marriage, following the legal disappearance of its prior holder, Marceau Lefebvre. Poirot's head turned slowly. Monsieur Lecourt, he said softly, "Do you recall what Mademoiselle de Charme told us?" "That she saw a figure in the lantern room." René nodded. "Yes, a woman, she thought." "Then perhaps," Poirot said, folding the paper slowly, "Madame Sorel is not merely the widow of a fortune, but the beneficiary of a vanishing." René blinked. "You think she's behind the letters?" "No." Poirot said, "She is not the type to beg for justice, but someone who knows what happened is growing bolder." He tapped the newspaper once. "The voice is not a ghost. Monsieur, it is the reckoning." Chapter 5. The first interviews began next morning. The sky over Saint-Émile was a bleached grey, the sea glassy and flat beneath its weight. The lighthouse, in the distance, had lost its menace in the soft morning light, but Poirot knew better than to trust appearances. Evil, he often said, did not require darkness. It merely required quiet. By 10 o'clock, he had returned to Lomies and Varnet at Amélie's request. A gathering had been arranged in the drawing-room. Poirot had asked for private interviews with each of the household's principal figures. Not all were willing. One, in particular, had tried to excuse himself with a fabricated errand in Nantes. Poirot, naturally, had insisted the drawing-room was cavernous and cold, its stone fireplace long since extinguished for the season. Poirot took the seat nearest the window, a thin leather notebook resting on the table beside him. Amélie had arranged his service, though he barely touched it. The first to be called in was Victor de Vigny. The solicitor entered briskly, shoulders squared. He gave Poirot a perfunctory nod and sat down without waiting to be asked. Poirot watched him over steepled fingers. "Monsieur de Vigny," he said mildly, "your loyalty to the Varnet family is widely known. May I ask how long you served as Monsieur Etienne's legal adviser?" 17 years, de Vigny replied. "Longer than most ministers serve in office." "Indeed," Poirot said, "during that time. Were you ever asked to manipulate the company's financial records?" De Vigny stiffened. "I don't care for your tone, monsieur." "Then answer plainly, and I shall adjust my tone." De Vigny exhaled slowly, then said, "Marceau Lefebvre's disappearance caused chaos. Etienne wanted stability. I obliged by ensuring all trace of his shares were consolidated. Consolidated, Poret echoed, which is to say, absorbed without due legal process. Divigny shrugged. Marceau was declared missing, after 7 years, legally presumed dead. It was all in accordance with the law, but not in accordance with morality. Perhaps, Poret asked softly. Divigny's jaw clenched. You're asking the wrong man. Talk to the widow, talk to the painter, or the journalist snooping in your shadow. They all have axes to grind. Poret's gaze sharpened. And do you, monsieur, do you have anything to protect? There was a pause. Then Divigny stood. I've nothing to hide. Poret watched him go in silence. Next came Violet de Charme. She entered the room with a certain aloof confidence. Sketchpad still in hand, she sat on the edge of the armchair and crossed her legs without ceremony. You're wasting time with the wrong people, she said without preamble. Divigny, Sorel, they're fossils. The real secret is in that lighthouse. Poret smiled faintly. You are very sure? Mademoiselle, I saw her, Violet said, voice low. The woman in the lantern room. She wore white. Her face was half shadow. I thought it was imagination, but then I returned last night, alone, and saw the same figure again. Poret leaned forward. You returned, alone. I wanted to see for myself. I couldn't sleep. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the page in her sketchbook. I drew what I saw. Look. She held it up. The sketch was stark, haunting, the top of the lighthouse framed in moonlight. A feminine silhouette barely visible behind the glass, hand pressed against the window pane. The proportions were too perfect to be fanciful. You have talent, Poret said gently, and perhaps a gift for observation. But tell me why so invested in this place? Mademoiselle, you've no blood here. Violet hesitated. Not by name, but my mother. She was Marceau Lefebvre's cousin. He helped her when she was pregnant, sent money from Paris. I grew up hearing that he'd been wronged. Poret studied her face. So you took the commission from Amélie, with another purpose, to find out what happened to him, and maybe to make someone feel what he must have felt, alone, erased. Poret nodded once. That is a motive, mademoiselle. But not from murder for revelation, I thank you. Violet stood, gathered her things, and left with a single glance back. Poret took a moment to process. Then came Sorel on it. The widow entered like a drifting fog dressed in immaculate grey. Her movements deliberate, eyes as unreadable as marble. She did not sit. Instead, she stood near the fireplace and examined Poret like a house guest she'd hoped would decline the invitation. You've disturbed this house, monsieur, she said without pleasantries. Old wounds should be left to heal. Old wounds, Poret replied calmly, do not heal if they were never cleaned. They fester. Her lips tightened. I did not kill Marceau Lefebvre, if that is what you're trying to imply. Poret rose and paced slowly, and yet you inherited from him the curious arrangement for someone you claimed to barely know. Sorel finally sat. Folding her hands, Etienne arranged it. He wanted me protected. The shares were merged into the family holdings. I had no say, but you benefited. She said nothing. Poret took a new tack. Madam, what do you fear more, the truth emerging now? Well, that someone else already knows it. Her eyes flickered. You don't understand. The past. It was dangerous even then. Marceau was not who everyone thought he was. He threatened Etienne. How? He claimed Etienne was laundering money through the Spain routes. He said he had proof. But Etienne, he was furious. Said Marceau was hallucinating from the morphine he was taking. Poret paused. Morphine. Yes, he had chronic pain. A carriage accident in youth. He was often erratic. Poirot made a mental note, but lucid enough to write letters to your stepdaughter, and to request me. Years later, she didn't. Reply, merci. Madam, Poirot said, I shall not detain you longer. Sorel rose. Be careful, monsieur. You stare too long into dead things. They may begin to speak back. When she was gone, Poirot sat once more, hands resting neatly on the table. 3 interviews, 3 layers of evasion. He had not found the murderer, but he had found the fear. That, he thought, was the first true clue. Chapter 6. The First False. It was just past noon when Poirot took his leave of the Varnet estate. The sky had turned restless again, grey clouds pushing in from the west like a warning. The sea hissed against the cliffs, and gulls wheeled above the lighthouse, their cries sharp and strange. Poirot did not return to his lodgings instead. He instructed the driver to take him directly to the small police outpost in Saint-Émile-sur-Mer. Though the gendarmerie had played no role thus far, he believed they might possess fragments of forgotten truth-buried reports, overlooked evidence, minor contradictions that no one else had bothered to stitch together. The officer on duty, a broad-shouldered man with a moustache far inferior to Poirot's, was at first skeptical of the little Belgian visit. You're here about the lighthouse, aren't you? He muttered, sorting through an overfull cabinet of dusty folders. That place is cursed. Half the village avoids it. Strange sounds, shadows, missing cats. Children say it's haunted. Poirot gave a patient nod. And yet, mon capitaine, I am less concerned with shadows than with paperwork. I understand there was a disappearance in 1920. Marceau Lefebvre. The officer pulled out a folder marked in smudged ink. A dead file. Never reopened. No body. No witnesses. His name came up a few years ago. Someone claimed to have seen him in Bordeaux, but it was nonsense. Poirot took the folder. Inside were to type statements. One from Etienne Varnet, the other from a lighthouse keeper named Lucien Belot. Read Varnet's first. Marceau Lefebvre and I met briefly on the night of March 12th. We argued. He stormed off, drunk. I assumed he returned to the village, but he never arrived. I left after waiting half an hour. I did not see him again. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Drunk, he says. There was no mention of this in the family letters. Next, Lucien Belot's statement. I was off duty the night Lefebvre disappeared. I did not see him, but the following morning, the topmost room of the lighthouse was open. A bottle of red wine had been smashed. No blood, no other sign of struggle. Poirot's gaze lingered on that last sentence. His smashed wine bottle, the same detail he had encountered days earlier. During his visit to the lighthouse, he leaned back, so the evidence of a quarrel was preserved and ignored. Curious, the officer grunted. Everyone assumed he ran. The war had just ended. People vanished all the time. Poirot returned the file gently. Did anyone ever consider that the lighthouse keeper may not have been entirely truthful? The officer scratched his head. Belot, retired in 1925, died in 38, lived, alone until then, kept to himself. Poirot stood. It is always the men who keep to themselves who know the most. Thank you, monsieur. You have been most helpful. As he left the station, his mind was already circling the contradiction. The smashed wine bottle had survived time and neglect. That, in itself, was remarkable, but more so was the absence of one key element. The glass from the broken bottle had been swept into a corner, old but not untouched. Someone had tidied the scene recently. He walked toward the village square, deep in thought. When he saw him, René Lecourt, the journalist, was seated at the café terrace, hunched over a notebook and half-finished espresso. He looked up as Poirot approached, feigning surprise poorly. Well, if it isn't the great detective, he said, closing his notebook quickly. Out for a stroll. Porritt gave a faint smile. Out for the truth, monsieur. Always, he said, and invited. May I ask what brings you back to Saint-Émile? You said you were writing about local folklore, and yet you seem rather attached to one story in particular. René chuckled nervously. It's the most compelling one. Indeed, Porritt said. And you were very quick to retrieve that newspaper from me. We, almost as if you knew, precisely where to find it. Reen's smile faded. You think I'm hiding something? I think, Porritt said gently, that you are not a man who stumbles. You arrive too conveniently. You know too much, and yet you pretend to know nothing. The silence stretched. Then René said, All right, I wasn't entirely honest, Porritt nodded. Go on. My father, René said quietly, was not just a fisherman. He once worked for Marceau Lefebvre as a bookkeeper. He told me, before he died, that Lefebvre had discovered something embezzlement, falsified contracts, shipping routes that didn't exist. He kept quiet for years, but he left notes, letters. And he always said that if anyone could bring it to light, it was you. Porritt narrowed his eyes. So you came not as a journalist, but as a son. René nodded. I wanted to expose the truth. I thought maybe, if I stirred the story, someone would panic, say too much. Porritt considered this. It explained the half-truths, the secret visits to the lighthouse, the record player perhaps used as a decoy to generate voices. You were the one playing the recording, Porritt said at last. René didn't deny it. It wasn't malicious. I just wanted to shake things loose, and you succeeded, Porritt said. But now, monsieur, we must separate the false from the real. You have played the ghost. But someone else is playing a far more dangerous game. He stood. You are not the murderer, but you have stirred the nest. René rose as well. Will you tell Amélie? Porritt gave him a long look. No, not yet. But if you interfere again, monsieur, I will consider you not just a witness but a suspect. The sea wind had risen again, and though René Lecourt had cleared himself of murder, he had revealed something more vital. The murderer now believed the past had truly returned. And that made them very, very afraid. Chapter 7. The Psychological. Gameth next evening fell with a strange hush over Saint-Émile. The wind had softened. The sky is steely blue devoid of stars, and the lighthouse still dark, still silent stood with the stillness of something watching. Hercule Poirot returned to Lomies and Varnet not to ask questions, but to listen. It was time for a silence to do the talking. The drawing room was empty when he arrived, as requested. He had asked Amélie to call everyone to a small after-dinner gathering informal. Nothing more than drinks and idle conversation, but Poirot had no intention of making it idle. At precisely 9, the first arrived, Victor de Vigny, his brow furrowed, his manner suspicious. Next came Madame Sorel, elegant in silver, her expression fixed in elegant disdain. Violet de Charme wandered in without ceremony, eyes flicking round the room like a cat sniffing danger. Finally, Amélie herself entered, a silk shawl drawn, tied round her shoulders. Poirot stood by the fireplace, hands folded. Samus, he said smoothly, thank you for joining me. I find that conversation, when unforced, is more illuminating than interrogation. Sorel sank into an armchair. Is this meant to be some sort of parlour game? But of course, Poirot replied. And you are all excellent players. He poured himself a small glass of port, but did not drink. His eyes moved from face to face, gauging reactions. Let us speak. He began. Of what people remember, and what they choose to forget. Double quotes silence. He continued. Marceau Lefebvre vanished from this coast 15 years ago. Officially, he fled the country. But that story is unraveling. There are signs he was lured to the lighthouse, that he intended to confront someone, that he may never have left. De Vigny scoffed. We've heard all this. Poirot turned toward him. You are a man of law, Monsieur de Vigny. Surely you know that the past cannot be buried if the body is never found. De Vigny opened his mouth, then closed it. Poirot pivoted. Madame Sorel, you inherited from the disappearance. You married Etienne after Marceau vanished, yet you have always claimed to know little of their quarrel. I still do, she replied coldly. Curious, Poirot mused. Because I have found copies of telegrams sent from your apartment in Paris to Etienne the week of Marceau's disappearance. Private telegrams, arranging a meeting. Sorel stiffened, but said nothing. Poirot smiled gently. But let us not accuse. Instead, let us observe. He walked slowly behind each of them, as if inspecting exhibits in a gallery. You see, someone among us is afraid, very afraid, not of what I might discover, but of what others might remember. He paused beside Violet. Mademoiselle de Charme, you said you saw a woman in the lighthouse, a figure in white. But might it not have been a man, cloaked in something else to confuse the eye? Violet frowned. You think it was deliberate misdirection? Poirot nodded. We, and someone has gone to great lengths to keep the lighthouse's secrets alive. Perhaps to frighten Miss Violet, or perhaps to keep others silent. He turned now to Amélie. Tell me, Mademoiselle, has anyone threatened you? She blinked. No strange letters beyond those already given to me. She shook her head. Nothing. Poirot looked at her for a long moment. You are very brave. She offered a tight smile. I don't feel it. Poirot turned to the group. Let us consider the record player. An old machine left in the tower, used, perhaps, to create the illusion of a ghostly voice. Yet the voice calls out a name. Marceau, not vengeance, not justice, not even murder, just Marceau. He let the name linger in the air. Why call the name of a man long presumed dead? He asked softly, unless one believes he is not truly dead. The effect was subtle, but Poirot caught it. A flicker, a hesitation. Madame Sorel's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the stem of her glass. He moved toward her. You have seen something, madam, or heard something. You would not fear so much otherwise. She did not respond. Poirot did not press. Instead, he addressed the room. There is something I have not yet shared. A new letter was discovered. Not old, but recent. It was not delivered. It was intercepted. De Vigny sat upright. Intercepted. By whom? Poirot gave a faint smile. That, monsieur, I am still considering. He moved to the fireplace and drew from his pocket a folded page. It was anonymous, its lines typed hastily on brittle paper. He read aloud. She knows. She's always known. The others believe the story. But she was there that night. If she speaks, everything unravels. I cannot be part of it any more. He closed the letter. Not a confession, but a fracture. A crack in the fawade. Silence fell again. Poirot turned back to the group. Tell me who among you was at the lighthouse on the night of Marceau's disappearance. No one answered, but Violet looked. As Sorel, Amélie looked at de Vigny, and de Vigny looked straight ahead. Poirot smiled. That is enough. The guilty will not answer, but they will react. He placed the letter on the table. Bonut, Mzamas, he said, sleep lightly. Tomorrow I return to the tower, and I shall not return alone. He stepped out into the cold night behind him. Silence cracked like a fissure. One of them was very close to breaking, and Poirot, ever patient, ever precise, would be there when they did. Chapter 8. The shadow behind the dawned morning sun rose pale and uncertain, casting long fingers of light through the mist that had settled over St. Emile like a veil. The lighthouse stood once, again in full view, but it no longer looked abandoned. It looked watched. Hercule Poirot stood at the foot of the cliffs, his polished shoes coated with the damped breath of the sea. He gazed upward with calm deliberation, the tower looming above as though braced for a confrontation. He was not alone. Amy, acute Livarnet, stood beside him, wrapped in a dark cloak, her expression unreadable. At her insistence, she had joined him for the return to the lighthouse. Poirot had hesitated at first, but in her eyes he had seen something essential resolve. "Have you ever been inside it during the day?" he asked her. She shook her head. "Nothing." Poirot looked at her for a long moment. "You are very brave." She offered a tight smile. "I don't feel it." Poirot turned to the group. "Let us consider the record player. An old machine left in the tower. Used, perhaps, to create the illusion of a ghostly voice. Yet the voice calls out a name. Marceau, not vengeance, not justice, not even murder. Just Marceau." He let the name linger in the air. "Why call the name of a man long presumed dead?" he asked softly, "unless one believes he is not truly dead." The effect was subtle, but Poirot caught it. A flicker, a hesitation. "Madam." Sorel's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the stem of her glass. He moved toward her. "You have seen something, madam, or heard something. You would not fear so much otherwise." She did not respond. Poirot did not press. Instead, he addressed the room. "There is something I have not yet shared. A new letter was discovered. Not old, but recent. It was not delivered. It was intercepted." Davigny sat upright. "Intercepted? By whom?" Poirot gave a faint smile. "That, monsieur, I am still considering." He moved to the fireplace and drew from his pocket a folded page. It was anonymous, its lines typed hastily on brittle paper. He read aloud. "She knows. She's always known. The others believe the story. But she was there that night. If she speaks, everything unravels. I cannot be part of it any more." He closed the letter. Not a confession, but a fracture, a crack in the facade. Silence fell again. Poirot turned back to the group. "Tell me who among you was at the lighthouse on the night of Marceau's disappearance." No one answered, but Violet looked at Ariel. Emily looked at Davigny, and Davigny looked straight ahead. Poirot smiled. "That is enough. The guilty will not answer, but they will react." He placed the letter on the table. "Bonut, Msamus," he said, "sleep lightly. Tomorrow I return to the tower, and I shall not return alone." He stepped out into the cold night behind him. Silence cracked like a fissure. One of them was very close to breaking, and Poirot, ever patient, ever precise, would be there when they did. Chapter 8. The shadow behind the dawned morning sun rose pale and uncertain, casting long fingers of light through the mist that had settled over St. Emile like a veil. The lighthouse stood once, again in full view, but it no longer looked abandoned. It looked watched. Hercule Poirot stood at the foot of the cliffs, his polished shoes coated with the damped breath of the sea. He gazed upward with calm deliberation, the tower looming above as though braced for a confrontation. He was not alone. Amy, acute Livarnet, stood beside him, wrapped in a dark cloak, her expression unreadable. At her insistence, she had joined him for the return to the lighthouse. Poirot had hesitated at first, but in her eyes he had seen something essential resolve. "Have you ever been inside it during the day?" He asked her. She shook her head. Not since I was a child. My father forbade it, said it was unsafe. But I remember, once, I saw him come down from there in the rain. His coat was torn. His hands were red. He never spoke of it, Purit's eyes narrowed slightly. And did he speak to anyone that day? She looked down. To Davigny. They argued behind closed doors. After that, I never saw the lighthouse door open again. They climbed the winding path in silence. At the entrance, Purit produced a new key given to him by the local mayor, whose curiosity had finally been piqued by the strings of scandal. The rusted hinges protested, but the door swung open, the scent of damp stone and old secrets flooding outward. Inside, the dust was less settled than before. Purit noted scuff marks along the floorboards, recent enough to suggest activity since his last visit. A thin layer of sea sand had been disturbed. As though someone had dragged a heavy object toward the stairs, Purit motioned Amelie to stay behind him and began his slow ascent. The quarters on the second floor remained as they had been. The broken wine glass still glittered in the corner, the desk undisturbed, and the old gramophone missing its needle carefully removed since his last visit. But something had changed. A cupboard, previously closed, now stood ajar. Purit moved to it and opened it fully. Inside, wrapped in a moth-eaten cloth, was a satchel, not an antique, newer, leather, cracked but intact. He brought it to the desk, unwrapped it carefully. Inside, old ledgers, handwritten pages, receipts, lists of cargo shipments from 1919 to 1920, each annotated. Some routes had small marks beside them, others were underlined, but one line, in red ink, caught Purit's attention. Bordeaux Santander, no ship, no manifest, fraudulent entry signed. M.L. Purit's eyes gleamed. Voila! Amelie hovered nearby, breath held. That's Marceau's handwriting. It is, Purit said. These are his records. A secret ledger. He documented the falsified trade routes. He knew someone your father. Perhaps Davigny was laundering money through ghost shipments, and this, he lifted the red-marked entry, was his proof. But why leave it here? She whispered. Purit looked upward, because he meant to confront someone with it, and he never made it out. They climbed again, now to the lantern room. Light filtered in through the dirty panes, casting strange reflections. The air was thick with salt and something else. Fear. Purit moved to the corner where he had found the fingerprint days earlier. He bent down and examined the floor beneath the glass window dot, and then he saw it. A faint groove in the stone, long, narrow, and deliberate, as though something had been slid across it. Something heavy. A trunk, he murmured, or a body. Amelie said nothing. Purit rose and walked slowly around the circular room. In the wall was a small iron latch on access to a crawl space behind the lantern machinery. He tugged it open. Inside was darkness dot and a shoe. A single, leather dress. Shoe dried with age. Split at the heel. Purit turned it over. Stamped faintly in the sole was a maker's mark. Cordonnier Lefebvre. Rudy Chaudhry's. He held it out. Your family had no dealings in New Orleans. Amelie took a slow breath. That was Marceau's brother's shop. Purit nodded gravely. Then this is not just debris. It is a relic of violence, left behind. Perhaps forgotten, perhaps hidden. They descended in silence, back at the base of the tower. Purit knelt once more by the entrance. There, barely visible beneath the doorframe, was a bent metal object lodged into the floor dot. He extracted it gently. A watch chain. The clasp was broken, the kind worn in waistcoats. And engraved on the tiny tag, M.L. Purit stood slowly. Someone tried to erase him. He said, But they left behind his echoes. They stepped outside into the morning light. Both changed as they reached the bottom of the path. A figure was waiting Violet de charm. She looked shaken, her cheeks flushed. From the climb. You were right, she said, breathless. He's trying to destroy the evidence. Poirot raised a brow. Who? Divigny. He's in the archives, the family files, Amélie's father's old books. I saw him take a bundle of documents. He was burning them behind the greenhouse, Amélie's voice sharpened. Today, this morning, Poirot's face became stone. It begins, he said, the panic. He turned to Amélie. We must act swiftly now, before more vanishes into smoke. Chapter 9. Hidden connections be the time they returned to Lommy's and Vaughan. The sun had vanished behind a curtain of grey, and smoke still curled faintly from the far side of the estate gardens. Poirot's footsteps were fast, purposeful, and, unlike his usual genteel rhythm, he moved with a sense of controlled urgency. They followed the gravel path past the greenhouse and rounded the rear hedges where, behind a low stone wall, stood Victor Divigny, sleeves rolled up, face flushed, a brass poker in one hand and a scorched heap of paper in the other. He froze when he saw them. This is old trash. He stammered, outdated ledgers, worthless. Then, why burn them in secret? Monsieur, Poirot's voice was calm, but clipped. Why not place them in the family's archive bins? Divigny's eyes darted to Amélie, then to Violet, and then back to Poirot. Because I don't have to answer to you, Poirot stepped forward and plucked the top half-burned sheet from the pile. He blew gently on the ash, revealing partial columns of numbers, dates, names, locations. His eyes narrowed. Santander, Vigo, Lisbon. These are the same trade routes referenced in Marceau Lefebvre's private ledger. Why are they listed here under different ships ones never registered? At port, Divigny's jaw clenched. Your assumptions are dangerous. No. Monsieur, Poirot said, holding the paper up to the wind. It is not I who is in danger. It is the truth. Amélie stepped between them. Victor, did my father know you were hiding these? He said nothing. Poirot lowered the page. Mademoiselle, I suggest you ask your housekeeper to retrieve the remaining records in the East Wing's cabinet. Anything dated March through July 1920. Have them locked and inventoried immediately. Divigny threw down the poker. So this is how it ends. You tear down a dead man's name, drag the rest of us into the mud. Poirot turned to him slowly. It is not I who buried the past, but I will unearth it. He stepped away. You will remain available for questioning. Should you attempt to flee, I will consider that a confession. Divigny didn't answer. Inside the house, Poirot gathered Amélie and Violet in the study. Rain began to tap gently against the windows. A soft percussion of gathering consequence. Violet sat near the fire, the sketchbook on her lap unopened. She seemed lost in thought. Poirot poured himself a small cup of tea, but did not drink. I believe it is time to expose the threads that bind this web together. He said, until now, each piece has stood alone, but now we must begin to tie them. He turned to Amélie. Your father's sudden wealth, his silence about Marceau, and the disappearance of certain files all point to a cover-up. But he did not act alone. Divigny certainly played a role. But what of Madame Sorel? Amélie looked up. She married my father shortly after Marceau vanished. Poirot nodded, and in doing so, she inherited assets that were never rightfully her husband's. But more importantly, she brought with her a connection, one that has not yet been revealed. He opened the ledger Violet had found in the lighthouse and flipped to a torn page on it, in small handwriting. Marceau had scrawled a name in the margin. E. de Charme. Violet leaned forward. "That's my mother." Poirot's eyes glinted. "Your mother, who received regular payments from Marceau. You told me she was his cousin. But this," he tapped the page, "this is different. This suggests involvement in the business, not as a relative, but as a witness." Amélie frowned. "What does it mean?" Poirot answered gently. "I believe your father used Marceau's ledger to manage two sets of records, one official, one secret. Your mother may have helped transcribe, deliver, or even hide certain documents. That's why she received money, perhaps in gratitude, or to ensure silence." Violet sat back. "She died when I was 12. I never knew." "No," Poirot said. "But someone else did. Someone who feared that if Violet became curious, the truth would unravel." He walked to the window, folding his arms behind his back. "This is no longer about a single man's disappearance. It is about a network of betrayal. De Vigny helped launder the records. Searle, I believe, was more than a passive beneficiary. And your father, Amélie, he chose legacy over justice." He turned sharply. "But the most dangerous person in this house is not the one who made the past dirty. It is the one who is now trying to keep it buried." A knock interrupted them. The butler entered, holding a folded piece of paper. This was slipped under the front door. "Monsieur," Poirot took it. He opened the envelope and read aloud. "If you go back to the lighthouse again, you will not return alive. Leave the past alone." The room fell into a breathless silence. Amélie's voice was then a threat. Poirot nodded, and a confirmation. Violet stood there desperate. Poirot folded the note. "Desperation reveals the hand. Whoever wrote this is cornered. They fear not just exposure, but that the body itself may be found." Amélie looked at him. "Do you think Marceau is still there?" Poirot's voice was quiet. "I think someone placed him where no one would ever look. But someone else knows, and now they are afraid the tide is turning." He stepped away from the fire. The voice in the lighthouse was not madness. It was memory. Artificial or real, it called out for a man whose name should have been cleared. The storm outside began to deepen. Soft thunder rolling over the cliffs. Poirot's silhouette stood in the window. "Unmoving, tomorrow," he said. "We return to the tower, and this time we bring a spade." Chapter 10. The Lighthouse. Yields a secret dawn broke over Saint-Emile with a strange, taut stillness. The village was quiet as though it, too, held its breath. Rain had stopped during the night, leaving behind a cold mist that clung to the coastline like a veil. The lighthouse stood as it always had, stark and looming, its glass lantern chamber staring blankly across the sea. But something had changed. Hercule Poirot stood at the base of the cliffs once more, dressed in his most weather-resistant attire, neatly pressed grey overcoat. Bowler had secured tight, and a walking cane in hand, more for precision than support. Beside him were two companions, Amélie Varnet, her expression taut with anticipation, and a grim-faced local gendarme named Inspector Flavien Morin, whose presence Poirot had insisted upon after receiving the anonymous threat. They carried no ceremony, just resolve and a canvas tool bag. The ascent to the lighthouse was silent. The wind stirred only now and then, like a whisper at their backs. When they reached the door, Poirot inserted the key once more. The iron hinges groaned louder than ever, and it felt, as Poirot quietly noted, as if the tower had been expecting them. They did not pause in the lower levels. Poirot led them straight to the lantern room. There, at the base of the inner wall, he pointed to the hatch he had discovered days before. "The access space," he said softly, "used for maintenance in years past. But I suspect now It hides something far less functional. The hatch creaked open. The air that drifted out was heavy with dust and mildew. Inspector Moran knelt and shone a lantern inside. The crawl space was narrow but extended deep into the stonework, a forgotten cavity no longer shown on modern diagrams. Porritt stepped back. "We begin here." Moran climbed in carefully, followed by Amelie, who knelt just at the edge, unwilling to enter but unwilling to look away. Inside, the inspector scraped through a thin layer of debris, dried wood, dust, discarded hinges. Then, a sudden sound metal. Striking metal. Moran froze. "Monsieur Porritt, I think yes. There's something beneath the stone." Porritt crouched, voice low. "A hidden chamber. Perhaps just a cavity." Moran reached into the bag and withdrew a small iron chisel. With slow, careful strikes, he chipped at the mortar. His slab shifted, and there, beneath it wrapped in oilcloth, still dry despite theirs, was a long, narrow trunk. Moran and Porritt exchanged a glance. The inspector pried open the lid. Inside was darkness. And then bones, not scattered, but neatly arranged, as though someone had laid the body down with purpose, or with guilt. A long coat still clung to the skeleton's frame, crumbling into dust at the edges. At its side, his small metal case. Porritt lifted it with gloved hands. "Medical," he murmured. "Morphine vials, empty." Amelie's hand flew to her mouth. "Is it?" Porritt nodded solemnly. "It must be." Moran examined the remnants carefully. No trauma to the skull. Nothing obvious. Because the violence, Porritt said, was not physical. It was betrayal. They let him die, or worse, ensured it. He turned to Amelie. This was Marceau Lefebvre. The final ledger was his coffin. Whoever placed him here did so with the intent of erasing him, but not hastily. They did not panic. They planned. They concealed. Amelie whispered, "My father." Porritt was quiet a moment, then said, "Or someone who acted for him." Perhaps too eagerly, Moran called down to a deputy waiting below. "We'll need forensic confirmation. But yes, I'd wager this is our missing man." Porritt stood and dusted off his hands. "Let us go back down. There is now a truth to confront." That evening, a storm rolled in from the west. The drawing room at La Maison Varnet was lit only by firelight and a single electric lamp. Sorel Varnet sat near the fireplace in silence, wrapped in a thick shawl. Violet stood at the window, arms crossed. Divigny had not been seen since midday. Porritt entered slowly, his overcoat still damp from the sea mist. Amelie followed behind him, her face pale but resolute. Porritt addressed them without preamble. "Marceau Lefebvre has been found in the lighthouse, dead, hidden beneath stone." Sorel stiffened. Violet turned from the window sharply. Porritt continued, voice unwavering. "He died with evidence in his possession, evidence of financial fraud, falsified routes, and criminal cover-ups, records that were supposed to be destroyed." Sorel stood. "This is absurd." "No, madam," Porritt said gently. "What is absurd is that so many believed this secret could be kept, that no one would return, that time would do your burying for you." He stepped closer. "You were there, weren't you? That night. You saw what happened." Sorel faltered. "I saw nothing. I was in Paris." Porritt's eyes gleamed. "No, madam, the telegrams place you at Saint-Emile. Witnesses saw your luggage at the estate. You were summoned by Etienne. Why? Because you knew how to clean up what others feared to touch." Violet stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You helped cover it up." Sorel turned to her. "You don't understand what your cousin was doing. He wasn't well." He was threatening to destroy the business. He'd become paranoid convinced. Etienne was stealing from him. Your father feared ruin. Porret's voice was low, so they met at the lighthouse. Words became shouting. Perhaps a push, perhaps not. But Marceau collapsed. He had taken morphine. He was weak, and they let him die. Amélie whispered. Porret nodded once, and afterward. He was hidden along with his proof. Sorel sat again, heavily. It was never meant to come out. But it has, Porret said. And now, Madam, the law will ask what part you played. Sorel did not reply. Porret turned away. Justice, he knew, was often delayed, but not denied. Not when the past had learned how to speak. Chapter 11. Tensions rose with storm that had threatened Saint-Émile all evening finally broke just after midnight. Rain lashed against the windows of La Maison Vannet, wind rattling the shutters with a fury that felt almost theatrical, as though nature itself were reacting to the unburied truth. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. The house was no longer cloaked in denial, but humming with unease, its residents now fully aware that the past could no longer be outrun. Porret, seated in the library with Inspector Morin, reviewed the final inventory of documents salvaged from the East Wing archives. Burnt edges, shredded margins, hasty redaction signs of a man, or several, trying to control a crumbling narrative, and now that the remains of Marceau Lefebvre had been found. The question was no longer what had happened, it was who had pushed it to the point of death. I do not believe the murder was a solo decision, Porret murmured, but I do believe only one person turned concealment into conspiracy. Morin frowned. De Vigny. Porret tilted his head. Or Sorel. But perhaps neither was the architect. Perhaps they were bonds of a stronger will, as if summoned. A knock came at the door. Amélie entered without waiting. Her hair was damp, her face pale. He's gone, she said. Porret and Morin looked up. De Vigny. She clarified. He left before dinner, took his briefcase to suitcases. The night manager at the inn says he paid in cash. No word since. Porret stood slowly. So, the trap has sprung. Morin swore under his breath. We'll check the roads in the morning. No need, Porret said calmly. He has not fled far. Men like de Vigny don't run from consequences, they run toward damage control, toward leverage. Amélie stared at him. You think he's going after something or someone? Porret nodded. He knows the walls are closing in, that the documents in Marceau's possession are now in the hands of the police, that Madame Sorel has all but admitted her presence that night, and that you, Mademoiselle Vannet, are no longer a child he can manipulate. She lowered her eyes. He raised me like a shadow, always protecting the estate. I thought it was loyalty. Now I wonder what else he was protecting. Porret turned to Morin, set a watch on the old marina, and the shipping office in the lower village. If de Vigny is looking for leverage, he may try to bribe, silence, or threaten anyone connected to Marceau's old shipping routes. Morin nodded and left immediately. Porret and Amélie remained in the library. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Amélie asked, Do you think my father knew what really happened? Porret did not answer at once. Instead, he walked slowly to the tall windows and watched the storm swirl over the cliffs. Your father, he said at last, was not a foolish man, but neither was he noble. I believe he chose not to ask questions. He allowed himself to be deceived, because the deception brought him power, and he let them get away with it. Porret turned, his expression unreadable, until now. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind streets slick with rain and the sea that rolled sluggishly beneath a veil of early fog. At the marina, Inspector Morin's men questioned fishermen and dock hands, but none had seen Davigny. His car had not been reported on any road leaving town, but at the estate. Porritt received a message that changed everything. It was delivered by hand, no return. Address, no signature. Typed again, in the same halting rhythm as the previous threats. He's meeting her. They never stopped. The truth is buried deeper than you think. Porritt reread it 3 times. Then he called for Violet Ducharme. She arrived quickly, jacket thrown over a nightdress, sketchbook still clutched in one hand. "Do you recognize this typewriter font?" he asked her. She frowned. "I've been seeing that all week. The spacing is off. It's an old German Adler model. My mother had one. After she died, I kept it in my studio. Where is it now?" "In my cottage, on the edge of the old vineyard," Porritt's eyes darkened slightly. "And who has access to that cottage besides you?" She blinked. "No one. I live alone." Porritt paced. "No housekeeper, no deliveries, no old family friends." She froze. "Well, Sorel visited once, months ago. Said she was checking in. She brought me tea and flowers." Porritt stopped. "Oh." Violet frowned. "You think it was her?" Porritt gave a cryptic smile. "Madame Sorel is a master of elegance, but she makes one mistake. She forgets that subtlety leaves fingerprints. Someone has been writing these letters, and they are not trying to stop the truth, but to guide it." Violet took a breath. "To point suspicion, to misdirect." Porritt agreed. The voice in the tower, the notes, the sketches, all breadcrumbs. But for whom and to what end? Just then, a maid burst into the study. "Mademoiselle Varnet, come quick." "Madame Sorel, she's collapsed." They rushed to the drawing room, where Sorel Varnet lay slumped in a high-backed chair, her skin ashen, her teacup shattered on the floor. A doctor was summoned at once. Porritt knelt beside her. She was breathing but faintly. He touched the teacup and sniffed. Bitterness, almond, mondu, poison. Amélie whispered. Porritt nodded grimly. Someone tried to silence her, but they were too late. The doctor arrived minutes later and began his work. Sorel was stabilized, unconscious but alive. Porritt stood and turned to the room. "Someone in this house has struck again. Not from panic, but from calculation. The truth is close now. So close they're willing to kill for it." He turned to Amélie, Violet, and the doctor. "No one leaves, and no one enters. The final move is coming." Chapter 12. The confrontation. It was just past noon, but the air inside Lomes and Varnet felt heavy. As though suspended in twilight, the storm had passed, yet a different kind of pressure had settled over the estate, one not of weather, but of reckoning. The staff moved about quietly, their steps hushed, as if any sound might crack the fragile silence that followed Sorel Varnet's poisoning. She lay unconscious in her bedroom under watch, guarded not just by a physician, but by Inspector Morin's men. The doctor reported she had ingested a small amount of cyanide, too little to be immediately fatal, but enough to render her comatose. Had she taken it willingly, in fear of disgrace? Or had someone intended to silence her more thoroughly, but miscalculated? Porritt believed neither. He believed it was staged, a warning shot, a mistake. He gathered the remaining key players in the parlour just after 1 o'clock. The room, typically reserved for leisure and polite society, now took on the air of a courtroom. Amélie stood by the window, pale but firm. Violet sat on the divan, her sketch-pad clutched tightly but unopened. Inspector Morin stood near the door, arms folded, and Porritt, poised at the fireplace, surveyed them all with calm detachment. "There is a moment," he began. In every great deception, when the web begins to collapse not because of force, but because of contradiction, he let the words hang. Someone in this room has lied. Not once, but repeatedly. Small lies, easily passed off. But a single inconsistency, a single misstep, yet voila. The truth peeks through. He turned to Violet. Mademoiselle, your mother, Elodie Deschamps, was thought to be only a distant cousin to Marceau Lefebvre, but we now know she was more than that. She was his confidant, his record-keeper. She may well have been the only person to whom he confessed everything. Violet nodded slowly. She died before she could tell me, or before she was allowed to, Pourette said softly, and that, I believe, was the first death in this long chain of silences. He turned. Next to Amélie, your father, Etienne, built his fortune in the shadow of Marceau's disappearance. He claimed betrayal, but he gained power, and those who served him Divigny. Sorel carried his secrets like loyal soldiers. Amélie stared at the floor, and now they've turned on each other. Pourette nodded, because something changed. A voice was heard, a figure seen in the lighthouse. Letters began to arrive, but not all of them came from the same hand. He moved to the center of the room. One letter typed in haste warned of Sorel's knowledge. Another threatened me. A third, most recently, said they never stopped. Curious phrasing. Not he or she, but they, an admission that two people were still conspiring. Pourette paused. Which brings us to Monsieur Victor Divigny. Amélie inhaled sharply. You found him, Pourette. Eyes narrowed. He returned to the estate 2 hours ago. Quietly. Through the servants' entrance. I knew he would. Not because he is foolish, but because he believes he can still control the narrative. He turned to the doorway. Bring him in. Inspector. Morin opened the door, and Divigny stepped inside, his coat damp, his expression calm but guarded. He looked older than he had just 2 days ago. Perhaps it was the weight of exposure. Perhaps it was the knowledge that his last chance was already slipping. Pourette gestured to a chair. Please, monsieur, sit. Divigny remained standing. If this is another performance, it is not a performance, Pourette said coldly. It is a verdict in progress. He produced the small metal watch chain found in the lighthouse, laying it on the table. Recognize this. Divigny didn't answer. Found beside the remains of Marceau Lefebvre, Pourette continued, along with ledgers detailing the falsified maritime records that you helped manipulate. Prove I did? Divigny said, chin lifting. Pourette tapped the chain. The ledgers are in your handwriting. Cross-referenced with archived manifests. Signed by you. We have them now, thanks to the ones you didn't burn. Sloppy. Divigny's jaw worked silently. Then he muttered, You have nothing. That man overdosed. He was always taking morphine. Pourette stepped forward. Yes, but he did not die of the drug. He died of betrayal, and you helped cover it up. He took another step, now directly in front of Divigny. But what matters most is not the death 15 years ago. It is what you did this week. You wrote the threatening note delivered to me yesterday. Divigny paled. Ridiculous. None. Pourette said calmly, The typewriter you used belongs to Mademoiselle Deschamps' family. You accessed her cottage under the pretense of visiting as an old family friend. But you returned, quietly. While she was painting near the cliffs, you typed your threats there, hoping to frame her just as you hoped to frame Sorel with a poisoned tea. Violet gasped. It was him. Pourette nodded. Madame Sorel was no longer useful. She was becoming a liability. She knew too much and might confess. So Monsieur Divigny slipped cyanide into her tea, likely stolen from an old storage drawer in the estate's pharmacy. But he gave too little. The dose was miscalculated. Davigny backed toward the wall, with sputtering. "You can't prove—" "I don't need to," Porritt said coldly. "Because in your desperation to silence the past, you left behind your most damning clue." He held up the page from the burned ledger found behind the greenhouse. The paper. It was cut from Marceau's original ledger, but only you had access to the originals before we locked them. You burned this sheet. But you didn't realize it had an imprint. Porritt stepped forward, drawing a pencil from his pocket. "Run the side of the pencil across this blank sheet," he said to Inspector Moran. The inspector did dot, and slowly, ghostly, a name appeared beneath the pencil strokes. "V. Davigny, February 19, 20 Davigny." Slumped. "You've destroyed yourself," Porritt said quietly. "Not because you were evil, but because you were arrogant. You thought the past had no voice." He turned to Amelie. "But it did. It whispered in ledgers, in sketchbooks, in ruined rooms, and now it speaks aloud." Moran stepped forward, cuffs in hand. "Victor Davigny, you are under arrest." But before he could finish, Davigny lunged for the fireplace poker. Porritt stepped aside. Moran tackled him to the ground. Disarming him in seconds, Porritt smoothed his coat and looked down at the man. "Violence, monsieur, is the last tool of the man who has lost control." He looked to the window. Rain had started again. Gently, but for the first time in years, the house was clean of its secrets. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. Rain outside fell in a thin, needling mist as Victor Davigny was taken into custody. Two gendarmes flanked him as he was led through the grand foyer of Lomé's in Varnet, now stripped of all its grandeur. His face was ashen, eyes unfocused. He did not struggle. But to Hercule Poirot, that stillness did not speak of surrender. It spoke of calculation. "He's waiting for something," Poirot murmured as he watched from the top of the staircase. A final card, a desperate one. Amélie, standing beside him, tightened her grip on the banister. What could he possibly do now? He's caught. Poirot's gaze was sharp. When the spider's web collapses, the spider does not simply die. It runs. Downstairs, Inspector Moran escorted Davigny into a waiting car. Rain glazed the vehicle's roof like polished steel. But just as the rear door clicked shut, Davigny lunged forward with explosive force, shoving the officer and slipping past the second gendarme before either could react. He bolted toward the back garden wallow, moss-covered, easy to climb. If one knew the footing, he scaled it with surprising agility, dropped over the other side, and disappeared into the trees. Shouts erupted. The second gendarme gave chase, slipping in the wet grass. Moran drew his pistol but held fire. Poirot descended the stairs calmly, not with alarm, but with certainty. "Let him run," he said. "We already know where he is going." The footpath behind the estate twisted down into the woods, eventually leading to the cliffs and the lighthouse. It was the last place Davigny had ever truly controlled, and in his mind, perhaps, the only place he could still hide what remained. Poirot, Amélie, Moran, and Violet followed in silence. Flashlights cutting through the mist, the wind had picked up again, and the sea below churned like an old wound reopening. They reached the base of the lighthouse within minutes. The door hung ajar. The bolt had been broken clean off. Moran entered first, flashlight drawn, weapon ready. They climbed in tense silence on the second floor. The keeper's quarters had been torn open, papers scattered, shells rifled through. "He's looking for the rest of the ledgers," Violet said quietly. "The ones we left in Poirot's care." Poirot nodded. "Yes, but he will not find them here." A noise above. Heavy footsteps. A door slamming. Then dashed the unmistakable crack of glass. They rushed upward. Emerging into the lantern chamber, there stood Divigny, breath ragged, eyes wide. One booted foot balanced on the steel ledge that circled the top of the tower. Behind him, the sea stretched into darkness. In his hand, a rusted iron box. Once hidden inside the crawl space, now pried. Open and have spilled, stay back. He balked, holding the box like a lifeline. These are mine. You have no right. You mean, Porret said gently, the documents you tried to burn. The ones detailing how you funneled false profits into offshore accounts. Or perhaps the shipping bribes paid to your friends in Lisbon? Divigne's jaw tightened. They're gone. Victor, Porret continued. We have copies. The police in Paris will have them by morning. There is nothing left to erase. Divigny staggered slightly as wind lashed his coat. I did what I had. Too. He shouted. Etienne was going to ruin everything. He didn't care what happened to the company. Marceau was going to expose us all. It would have collapsed. Porret moved a step closer. And so you let him die. I didn't. Kill him. Divigny roared. He took too much morphine. He collapsed. I didn't mean for it to happen like that. But you left him there. Porret said. You sealed him inside a wall. You destroyed his name. Divigne's eyes darted between them. I did it. For the company. For Amélie. For this estate. Amélie stepped forward now, her voice cold and steady. Don't pretend it was loyalty. You did it for control, for power. You played father while stealing everything that was mine. He faltered. Amélie, please. No, she said. This ends here. A long pause. Then Porret said softly, Monsieur Divigny, there are only two doors from this moment. One returns you to the earth with dignity, with trial. The other leads you into the sea, and the sea does not forgive. Divigny wavered. The wind howled, then slowly. He stepped down from the ledge, clutching the rusted box to his chest like a broken relic. Morin moved forward, cuffed him in silence. The storm passed again, and with it, the weight of 15 years. Of silence, they returned to the estate just after 3 in the morning. Sorel Varnet, still unconscious, remained under observation. The doctor believed she would wake in days, perhaps hours. Her role in the affair would be clarified once. She could speak for herself, but even if she never did, Porret knew the truth had already been assembled piece by piece. Divigny had confessed enough to seal his fate. Amélie sat in the drawing-room alone. Sipping a cup of cooling tea, Porret joined her without a word. They sat together for a long moment before she finally asked, Will this ever feel like justice? Porret tilted his head. Justice, mademoiselle, is not always a matter of satisfaction. Sometimes it is simply truth made known. She looked into the fire, and that is all we get. Porret smiled gently. It is enough. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into Placetwo. Days had passed since Victor Divigne's capture, and the winds over Saint-Émile had finally calmed. The village had begun to settle again into its rhythms, fishermen returning to the early tides, children playing near the quay, and gossip trickling like water through narrow alleyways. But within the high stone walls of Lomies and Varnet, the calm was still artificial. The storm had passed. Yes, but the wreckage remained. Porret sat in the estate's upper study, a small fire burning beside him, as he carefully turned the pages of the final document recovered from the lighthouse's crawl space. And like the other ledgers, this one was personal, handwritten, not in columns of numbers or coded shipments, but in prose. It was a journal, and it bore the initials M.L. Marceau Lefebvre. Amélie stood by the window behind him, her arms folded, tight across her chest. Violet was there too, leaning on the desk, her sketchbook unopened since the night of Devigne's arrest. Neither spoke as Poirot read, slowly and with profound stillness. Then he closed the book, exhaled, and turned to face them. "It is complete," he said softly, "the last piece, hidden not to shame, but to be found." Amélie stepped forward. "What did it say?" Poirot opened the final page again. "If you find this, then perhaps my death was not in vain. I was wrong to trust Etienne. But I write not in anger, only in hope that one day someone will ask the question no one else dared ask. Why would I flee? I loved this company, this family. I would have died for it, and I did." Silence followed his words. Poirot closed the book. Marceau did not. "Fight to escape," he said. He fought to be heard. His disappearance, his silence, his erasure, these were not acts of cowardice, but of calculated cruelty. Amélie sank slowly into the chair opposite him. "My father let him die," Poirot hesitated. "Your father may not have delivered the final blow, but he allowed the silence, and in doing so, he participated in the crime, and Sorel, her guilt, Poirot said, is more complicated. She assisted in the cover-up, yes, but the journal reveals she once tried to send anonymous letters to a maritime authority in Nantes. She had doubts. It appears Etienne intercepted them before they could be sent. After that, she stayed quiet, whether out of fear or complicity. We may never fully know. Amélie looked down at her hands. "The entire foundation of my life, my inheritance, the estate. The company, it's all stained." Poirot stood and walked to the window. "It is not stained. Mademoiselle, it is revealed. There is a difference. Stains remain hidden beneath clean appearances. But you have washed this one with truth." She met his gaze, and for the first time since his arrival, there was no bitterness in her expression, only tired gratitude. Violet finally spoke. "So what now?" Poirot turned to her. "Now, the courts will do their work. Devigny will stand trial. Sorel, when she recovers, will be questioned. The records will be unsealed. And the story, Marceau's story, will no longer be a ghost story." He looked down at the sketchbook, still in her hands. "May I see what you drew that night?" Violet hesitated, then slowly opened the book and flipped to a charcoal image near the end. It showed the top of the lighthouse under a moonlit skystack, haunted, but no longer foreboding. In the window stood a silhouette, not monstrous, not threatening, just present, watching. "I kept drawing her," Violet murmured. "Even after the figure disappeared, something told me it mattered." Poirot studied the sketch for a long moment, then said, "It did. Because the ghost was never supernatural. It was the shape of injustice waiting to be seen." A knock came at the door. It was Inspector Morin. "News," he said. "Sorel woke up this morning. The doctor says she's weak, but lucid. She asked for Mademoiselle Varnet." Amélie stood immediately. Poirot placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Go. Not to accuse, to listen." She nodded and left the room in silence. Morin turned to Poirot. "You're leaving soon." "Tomorrow," Poirot said. "I have lingered here long enough. Do you believe justice was done?" Poirot was quiet a moment. "I believe the truth was told. Whether the courts do their duty remains to be seen." Morin gave a slow nod, then excused himself. Poirot remained at the window a while longer, watching as the fog lifted slowly from the cliffs and the lighthouse appeared again, clear and whole, against the pale morning sky. He had come for a voice, and he had heard it. Later that evening, as the household began to settle, Poirot found himself once again in the lantern room of the lighthouse. Alone, he paced its circular edge, fingertips brushing the glass. Then, With delicate care, he opened the small drawer built into the base of the old lantern. Inside was one last item, an envelope, yellowed with age. On it, "Por Kiosi Kauta, for the one who dares to listen." Poirot opened. Inside was a note, scrawled in Marceau's hand. "Not all truths are loud. Some must be whispered across decades. If you hear me, then let this be my peace." Poirot read the line 3 times. Then he folded it, replaced it, and closed the drawer. The voice in the lighthouse had spoken. And the world, at last, had listened. Chapter 15. The final gathering. The drawing room of La Maison Varnet had once been a place of refined of polished silver trays and measure, the conversation of crystal decanters and inherited tapestries. Now, it bore witness to confrontation. It was Poirot's request that they all gather one last time. He had insisted on it, despite the hesitation in Amelia's voice and the suspicion in Inspector Morin's eyes. But Poirot was adamant. Truth was not complete until it was spoken in front of those who had lived beneath its shadow. So they came. Amelie entered first, composed, though visibly bracing herself. Her dark dress matched the weight of the moment. Violet followed quietly, still clutching her ever-present sketchbook, though today it remained closed. Sorel Varnet was brought in last, wheeled gently by a nurse. Her face was pale, her frame fragile, but her eyes sharp as ever. Poison had not taken her, and neither had guilt, not entirely. Whether by will or necessity, she had chosen to return. Poirot stood at the center of the room, immaculate in his charcoal gray suit, his silver pocket watch glinting beneath the light. "I thank you all for coming," he began, "because before I leave Saint-Émile, there is something I must do, not for the court, nor for the police, but for justice. True justice." He looked to each of them in turn. For 15 years, the disappearance of Marceau Lefebvre was treated as a mystery. Some claimed he fled. Others called him a thief. But he did not run. He did not steal. He died alone, betrayed, and entombed. In silence, he stepped towards Sorel. "You, madame, were present on the night of his death. You did not push him, but you helped your husband and Davigny conceal it. Perhaps you believed it necessary. Perhaps you told yourself it was mercy. But silence, too, is a weapon." Sorel's voice cracked, yet she spoke. "I never wanted him to die. He was," she faltered, then said, "he was good, to good. He trusted the wrong man." Poirot turned now to Amélie. "Your father, Etienne Varnet, used that trust. He was not the architect of murder, but he was the architect of ruin. He allowed greed to outpace loyalty. He chose wealth over truth, and when it was convenient, he vanished Marceau not just from life but from memory." Amélie did not flinch. "I believe you," she said quietly, "and I will answer for it, if I must." Poirot inclined his head. Then he moved to Violet. "You, mademoiselle." Other voice Marceau never had. "Your sketches, your observations, your courage to question what others dismissed, they brought the past to light. And though others tried to twist your story, to use your legacy against you, you endured." Violet looked down, not out of shame, but emotion. "Your mother," Poirot continued, "was no mere bystander. She helped Marceau document the truth. It cost her more than we will ever fully know." He turned to the room once more, and then, "There is Victor Davigny." His name lingered like a chill. He acted with cunning, with precision. He saw opportunity and seized it. When silence no longer served him, he tried fear. When fear failed, he tried poison. But what undid him was not a single mistake. It was the assumption that no one would look for it. placed a hand gently on the back of the chair he'd stood beside for nearly the entire case. I looked, because Marceau Lefebvre asked me to, not with his voice, not with his breath, but with his final hope sealed in a journal, left in a wall, whispered through a lighthouse. He turned to Amélie. What comes next is yours to choose. You may preserve the estate. You may dismantle the company, but you must do so in full sight of the truth. No more shadows. Amélie nodded. I understand. Poirot stepped back. Then I consider my task complete. But before he could leave, Sorel spoke again. Her voice was faint, but the room quieted to hear it. There was something I kept. She said, I didn't know why. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was fear. She motioned to the nurse, who reached into the folds of her blanket and produced a small object, a key. Poirot took it gently. To what? Madam, the cellar, she said, the old one. Beneath the greenhouse, your inspectors never searched. I locked it 15 years ago. Amélie inhaled sharply. I never knew it existed. Poirot turned the key over in his hand. Then I suggest, Mademoiselle, we open it together. The entrance to the cellar was buried beneath thick vines and stone, obscured by decades of forgetfulness. It took an hour to clear it, and another to carefully open the rusted latch. Inside, beneath flickering lantern light, they found a room long undisturbed. Crates of records, maps, maritime ledgers. And in the center, a locked iron box, the same. Insignia etched on its surface, Lefebvre Shipping and Trade. Poirot opened it. Inside, perfectly preserved, were the original and censored ledgers. A complete record of every false shipment, every siphoned franc, every name. He exhaled slowly. This, he said, is the heart of it all. Amélie stood at his side. We'll take it to the magistrates. Everything. No more secrecy. Poirot looked to her. Then the lighthouse will no longer be a monument to silence but to truth. She said nothing, but her eyes, for the first time in days, were clear. Chapter 16, the reveal 3 days later. A small crowd gathered in the great hall of the village courthouse in Saint-Émilion. Unlikely place for the unraveling of a legacy. The press had arrived, their notebooks poised like bayonets, whispering speculation into columns of ink. Local officials, maritime regulators from Nantes, and a quiet delegation from Paris sat behind polished desks as witnesses prepared to give testimony regarding the hidden books. The body in the lighthouse and the final collapse of the Varnet, Empire's illusion. But before any charges could be formally processed, Hercule Poirot had requested a private session, a gathering of all primary witnesses and interested parties under one roof, not for spectacle, for truth, the magistrate. A small man with bristling grey hair and tired eyes allowed it, evenly, to be done with the ghosts. He muttered. And so, in the courthouse's upper chamber, under tall windows that filtered in an overcast light, they assembled one last time. Amélie Varnet stood to one side, dignified and sombre. Violet Deschamps sat beside her, posture straight, sketchbook now replaced with a simple notebook. Madame Sorel, pale but composed, was wheeled into the room by a nurse. Inspector Morin stood in uniform silence by the door, and at the center of it all, standing as though commanding a stage, was Hercule Poirot. I thank you all, he began, for your presence today. What we now know is no longer a mystery, it is confession. But confession, like evidence, must be framed, and that is my purpose now. He turned, hands behind his back, pacing slowly. The case of Marceau Lefebvre was not merely a crime of disappearance. It was a performance, a layered deception meant to silence not just a man, but an entire truth. and every character played their part. He gestured toward a file laid neatly on the table before him. Here, we have the original ledgers hidden in a sealed cellar beneath the greenhouse, protected by a key kept in secret by Madame Sorel Varnet for 15 years. These documents prove that Marceau Lefebvre was correct in his suspicions. Etienne Varnet and Victor de Vigny embezzled funds through falsified shipping routes, but when Marceau threatened exposure, they lured him to the lighthouse under the pretext of reconciliation. He looked to Amélie. Your father did not plan to kill Marceau, but he was willing to let him die when the confrontation grew tense. Marceau, weakened by morphine, collapsed, and rather than call for help, Etienne and de Vigny chose silence. Final, deliberate silence. Poirot moved to the center of the room again. They buried him literally and legally. De Vigny sealed, his body in a hidden wall, removed from the world. His name was blackened in the company records, and a false narrative of betrayal was spread. The official story was set, and no one questioned it. He paused. No one until now. He turned to Violet. Mademoiselle de Charme, through your sketches, you made the invisible visible. You returned the figure to the lantern room, where it had always belonged. To Amélie, you invited me not with certainty, but with instinct. The instinct that something in your family's story was incomplete. You were right. To Sorel, and you, Madame, though complicit in silence, ultimately preserved the final truth. The key to the cellar, the sealed box. Why? Sorel spoke, slowly, because I feared what would happen if it was found. But I feared more what would happen if it was forgotten. Poirot nodded, and so it was not forgotten, because memory, Samus, is more enduring than gold. He turned to Inspector Morin. Victor de Vigny, arrested and currently under formal charge, has confessed in writing to conspiracy, falsification of records, and attempted murder. He admits to poisoning Sorel Varnet in an effort to prevent her from testifying. He also admits to writing anonymous threats to myself and to Miss de Charme, using a typewriter stolen from her family's cottage. Poirot drew a breath, and yet he insists that he did not murder Marceau Lefebvre, that his death was accidental, that he panicked. The room was silent. Poirot raised a hand. But this, too, is a lie. Gasps rippled across the chamber. Violet leaned forward. Amélie's brow furrowed. Poirot continued, voice steady. In Marceau's final journal preserved in the lighthouse, hidden in the crawl space, he describes his plan to confront Etienne. But he also writes that he suspected he might not survive the meeting. He writes, if I vanish, know that I did not run. Know that I faced Etienne and de Vigny with all the truth I could carry. Poirot opened the journal and laid it before them, but the final page, previously torn, was recently recovered from within the hollow lantern base, and it reads, they did not call for help. I begged, and they turned away. The morphine made me weak, but I saw Victor seal the chamber. He looked at me, and he closed the wall. There was no noise now. Even the courthouse clock seemed to have gone still. Poirot stepped back. So, you see, the death was not by accident. It was murder, not in a moment of passion, but in a moment of cold. Final choice. He looked to Amélie. I believe you now understand the full weight of the legacy you inherit. It is not merely financial, it is moral. What you do with that weight will define the future of this family's name. Amélie, pale but resolute, stepped forward. I will testify. I will surrender the estate's remaining records, and I will work with the authorities to compensate those who were defrauded by the company's actions. There will be no more lies. Poirot bowed slightly. Then, Mademoiselle, you have done what your father could not. You have restored honor not by preserving illusion, but by exposing truth. He closed the journal dot, and with that, the mystery of the voice in the lighthouse, the whispers, the warnings. The shadows came to rest not in silence, but in revelation. The voice had cried out for 15 years, and at last someone had answered. Chapter 17. Outcome, and Justice's courthouse emptied slowly, as if no one wished to be the first to step back into the world outside. Rain had begun again, a fine, persistent drizzle that cloaked the village in grey and made the narrow cobbled streets shimmer like wet slate. The lighthouse, still visible on the horizon, now stood less like a haunted relic and more like a watchful monument. Hercule Poirot remained behind in the chamber long after the others had departed. He stood at the window, his silhouette outlined in the misted glass, watching as the fog rolled gently over the sea. There was no victory in his posture, only calm reflection. He did not celebrate solved cases as others did. He understood that closure, for many, was merely the beginning of something else behind him. The door opened softly. Amélie Varnet entered, coat draped over her shoulders, her hair damp from the rain. She said nothing at first, merely stood beside him, mirroring his gaze toward the sea. "I keep asking myself what would have happened if I hadn't written to you," she said finally. Poirot replied without turning, "And I keep asking myself, what would have happened if no one had listened to Marceau Lefebvre at all?" She folded her arms. "It feels strange, like justice and ruin rive together. My father's name is lost, the company is broken, and yet I feel freer than I ever have." Poirot turned now to face her. "That is because truth, mademoiselle, is not a weight one carries. It is a shadow that disappears when you let in the light." Amélie gave a faint smile. "And what of Sorel? She will be questioned further," Poirot said. "But her role was one of concealment, not violence. If she chooses to testify truthfully, she may avoid prison. That will be up to the courts and Davigny." Poirot's voice grew cooler. "He will face trial in Nantes. The charges are considerable fraud, conspiracy, destruction of evidence, attempted murder. And now, murder." Amélie was quiet a long time. Then she asked, "Do you believe he regrets it?" Poirot looked out the window again. "Regret is the final currency of a man who has spent every other. But it comes too late to be useful." She nodded slowly, then asked the question she had been holding all along. "Do you think Marceau knew he would die?" Poirot hesitated. Then, gently, "I think he hoped his truth would outlive him. And it has." They left the courthouse together, descending the wide stone steps into the waiting fog. Violet Deschamps stood at the base, her satchel over one shoulder. She looked different, more solid, more certain. "I'm returning to Paris," she said. "There's a gallery that's asked to see my work. I'm thinking of calling the collection Lighthouse Echoes." Amélie smiled. "It's a beautiful name." Poirot inclined his head. "An echo only exists if someone listens." Violet gave him a warm look. "Thank you, monsieur, for hearing what the rest of us only felt." Poirot bowed slightly. "You did not need me to hear it, mademoiselle. You only needed me to confirm what you already knew." She turned to Amélie. "Will you keep the house?" Amélie shook her head. "No, I'll sell it. The money will go toward restitution for the workers and small investors Marceau's company defrauded. That was his dreamer company built on fairness. It's the least I can do." Violet nodded. "And the lighthouse?" Amélie looked toward it, its distant shape barely visible in the fog. "I'll donate it to the village. They can preserve it. Maybe turn it into a museum or a memorial." Poirot smiled faintly. "A lighthouse, once meant to guide ships, will now guide memory." 'Twas been. They parted at the crossroads, Violet toward the train station, Amélie toward the estate. Poirot, alone now, walked slowly toward the harbour, cane in hand. Mustaches neat even in the drizzle dot at the edge of the pier. He paused, looking out once more to sea. The lighthouse blinked faintly in the distance, no longer a symbol of silence, but of warning and remembrance. Poirot reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, the last page of Marceau's journal. If I am never found, let it be known, I did not vanish. I was buried, but even buried voices can rise. Again, Poirot folded it again and returned it to his pocket. A moment later, the ferry from Saint-Emile to Calais docked. Poirot stepped aboard. Behind him, the sea rolled on, and somewhere far above, the voice in the lighthouse fell finally quiet. Chapter 18. The closing remark. It was 7 weeks later. In the quiet stillness of a London spring morning, that Hercule, Poirot found himself once again seated at his usual table in the conservatory of Whitehaven Mansions. The windows were open just slightly, letting in the filtered sound of passing traffic and the fresh scent of budding magnolia trees. His breakfast was, as ever, ranged with precise balance: a perfectly folded newspaper, soft-boiled eggs in matching porcelain cups, and a single white orchid in a slender vase. He took his coffee in silence, eyes scanning the headlines. There, on page 3 of La Soie de France, was the latest article on the Varnet shipping scandal. The photograph beneath the headline showed Amélie Varnet standing at the gates of the Nantes courthouse, head high, hands clasped before her. Heiress delivers final statement. Truth is all that remains worth building upon. Poirot allowed himself a small, approving nod. Victor de Vigny had since confessed to all charges, including willful concealment of a death and falsification of trade records. The trial was scheduled for June. Sorel Varnet, it seemed, would not be prosecuted. Her medical condition and her late cooperation had spared her the full weight of the law, but her name, like Etienne's, would carry the stain of silence for years to come. A discreet knock at the door broke his thoughts. Poirot did not rise. He knew the rhythm well. In Trez, he said gently. His valet, Georges, stepped in, holding a small parcel. A letter for you, monsieur, from Saint-Emile. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Deja. He took the envelope, noting the seal, a simple wax impression of a lighthouse. He opened it delicately and drew out a single page, handwritten in violet ink. Monsieur Poirot, the lighthouse will reopen next month. We've converted the upper level into a memorial for Marceau Lefebvre, with excerpts from his journal on display. The villagers have embraced the project more warmly than I expected. I have also decided to rename the company under the Lefebvre name and dissolve the Varnet holdings entirely. It was not easy, but I feel it was right. The past cannot be repaired, but perhaps it can be relit. With gratitude, _V. Poirot smiled, folding the letter carefully. Georges stood waiting. Shall I file it with the other correspondence from your solved cases, monsieur? Poirot tapped the page gently. No, this one I shall keep nearby. He placed it in a slim leather folder beside his orchid, then leaned back in his chair, hands resting lightly on his lap. You know, Georges, he said softly, people often assume that the solving of a mystery brings relief, but I have found, more often, it brings revelation, and revelation is not always kind. Georges, used to these philosophical openings, waited with practiced patience. Poirot continued. The voice in that lighthouse was not a ghost, nor a sound of wind across stone. It was the voice of betrayal, of a man who refused to disappear quietly, and in the end, it was heard. He sipped his coffee. It pleases me to think, he said, that sometimes justice does not shout, it waits, quietly, until the right ears come along. Georges inclined his head. Very poetic, monsieur. Merci. Poirot said, and yet still true. Outside, the street cars clanged and the city stirred. But inside, in the conservatory filled with morning light and orchid perfume, there was only silence. Poirot, at peace, returned to his newspaper. The case was closed, the voices had quieted, and truth tidy, complete and undeniable, had had its say.